We're going to pick up where we left off on the last project, which you will find in the 103012 folder instead of the VB Intermediate Demos repo. And this one we're going to go off of what was just called the Candy project. So if you followed along last time, you would have pulled some code out of Candy project underscore no code. This one is just simply called Candy project, and we'll be building on that one. So where we left off before is we had this application that could go through and we could add candy into this. We could update the quantities depending on what it is that we had, and what was picked would populate these list box over here. And we could add that and the quantity would update. We could eat one and it would reduce the quantity on top. Now there's a couple things missing from our interface. One of them is that if we go through here and I reduce my quantity by eating a piece of candy, it doesn't immediately update. I have to actually go through and select the item again in order to get that quantity down. So before we build anything else, let's go through and maybe tighten up this interface a little bit more. And so what we should be doing is, just like when we added it, we want to be able to update it as well. And so inside of this list box here, what's happening is that when I add one in here and I do another one, so we're adding some gum. What happens is that when I eat one, whoops, I'm refreshing my list box, and you'll notice that when I refresh my list box, because that's what we wanted to do, we're losing that selected index. And so what we want to do is, every time the selected index changes, we want to store that away somewhere so that when the list box is refreshed, we can persist that data in there. So that's going to happen inside of this here. And what we want to do is we want to declare class variable so that this will actually persist across button clicks. And then we'll set that on selected index changed right up here. Now, when we go in and we do our update list box, we're clearing it, we're setting the value here, and now here we can go through and we can reset that selected index. And what we should probably do, just to be safe, is make sure that the selected index we're setting isn't bigger than the available list index. Sorry, habit, get rid of that. And let's see what we end up with. All right, add. And it looks like it's working more like what we wanted to do. Another thing is, if I want to edit more data than just the quantity here, maybe I want to say, well, not gum, I wanted to say, actually this is This is Big Red gum. If I added it in, it's going to add a new item to my candy bag, to my collection of candy. But what I really wanted to do was edit it. And so instead, what I'd have to do is eat all of that one and then maybe add it in again. But what I really want to do is I want to edit this. So if I could say, you know, deluxe suckers. There's really no way to update this. So what we want to do is we want to add an update button that lets us sort of make sure that this data here is current. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to borrow our code that we used from before, and we're going to say if our candy dot contains lst candy dot selected item. Remember, selected item is the key that we added our candy to our collection with. And then we declare a temp value. Remember, we're able to do this because, oops, that's our candy. We're able to add that and use that key as an index. Just like we used to use 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way to count, we can use this key value as an index now. And my Visual Studio's dog, and there we go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to update these values with what is in our text box, just like when we initially added it. And then that will update those values in there. So let's test this out. Add a bunch of that quantity in. Let's add some gum. And so I'm going to change this instead to deluxe and update. It did not go through. Or did it? So what's happening here is that we are updating this, but we forgot to update the user interface as well. And we have to refresh our list box after this happens. So we add a couple suckers, add some gum, and now when we do update, we just have to refresh our list box. So what's come up since we've started doing a lot of this object-oriented programming is, you know, we go through all this work of defining our car class or a movie class, and we create our data and we add it in there. And every time we create this data, we have to enter all the fields in, we have to add it to our array list, and when the application closes down because of the scope and because of the nature of the way applications work, all that data disappears. And all of us really know as users, you know, whether we're talking web or desktop applications, that we have the ability to either have our data persist in the form of something that shows up when we log in, or maybe we're opening a file or seeing a recent file, and we have this concept of being able to save and load our files into that. And so that's really the next step for us to go through there. Is we have our data structured out, but now we want to be able to say, well, how can we persist this? Now, for the sake of this example, we're going to be handling a lot of this file input and output on the form itself. This is to really show you the mechanism for doing this, but really what we would do is we would try and separate this logic out into a separate class so that we have the concept of a UI, a data layer, and a business logic layer. Now, you won't always have 3 separate distinct layers. Sometimes you'll have 2. You may have all your code into 1. You may have more than 3 layers. So it depends on what it is that you're doing and if it makes sense to separate that out in other classes. When possible, it's always best to be able to do that way. But for the sake of the example today, we're just going to keep this on the form. And what we need to acknowledge up to this point is that essentially where we've been storing our data has been in this collection class. And that's going to be, I would say, a very crude data layer with what we're doing. And so we're going to keep with this. And what we're going to do is we're going to practice loading data from a text file into this collection of our Candy objects. And so first what we have to do is we actually have to create where this data is going to go. And for the sake of what we're going to do here, I am going to create an empty text file. And I'm going to call it Candy Data. And inside this file, and this is the other really important part, is we're the designers here, we're the developers. We get to decide how our data is actually stored. If I wanted to have it all encrypted and we wanted to decrypt it every time, that's within our rights. If I wanted to use it as a pipe delimited file, delimited meaning the pipe character would separate these things out. So we have something like gum and sucker and Butterfinger. This would be a pipe delimited file. This would be a comma delimited file. We're going to go with comma, but also what we're going to do is separate each instance by a line. So one line is going to represent a single instance of that object, and on that single line it's going to have all of the attributes. And what's important here is that we can take a consistent approach with how we're storing our data. So it's going to look something like this. My name, that flavor, and then a quantity. These are the 3 attributes that make up this class. So these are 3 separate things that we're talking about. We have a sucker, red, cinnamon gum, and a Butterfinger candy bar. The order of the position is very important. So if I can go down the line here, I can say, okay, this is the name, this is the flavor, and lastly, this is the quantity. And if I can count on my data file being consistent, I can start using this to my advantage. If I expect it to be in a certain order, then I can write code that knows what to do with it. So the next thing I'm going to do is I want to take this file and I want to start reading the data out of it. And what I want to do initially is, this is something that's probably going to go on my form load. The first time my application loads up, I'm going to want to load in the existing data. I'm going to declare a sub as my entry point. I'm going to say load candy. Before we go any further, I want to import system.io because we're going to actually be reading some stuff from files here. And so it's going to go on these steps. We're going to open the file, read each line contains instance attributes. Add new instance to the collection. So the first thing we need to do, since we're reading a file, is declare a reader for that file. Remember that because we have our file inside of our project here, the relative path from where the executable is going to be .. .. and then our file name. Now, to be able to loop through the file, remember we want to be able to read each line separately. So to do that, what we were using before is read to end, but now we want to read each line. So we're going to use something called peek. And what peek does is it will look ahead in the file to see if the file has reached its end yet. If the end has been reached, peek will return a -1. So if we do while reader.peek is greater than -1, we can count on each line still being available. Each line will still be read out as a string. This string is going to contain the actual data for each instance of what we want to add to the collection. So I'm going to call this my temp candy string, and that is going to equal reader.readLine. This will read a whole line of my file and advance it on to the next one, so that each time I do my while loop, I'm going to get one of these lines. Now remember, we separated all of our attributes out with commas. So what we should be able to do now is say let's say temp attributes as string array equals temp candy string dot split on the comma. Did not like that, so we're going to switch to this, and there we go. So what happens is it read the line through, split that line on a comma, so now inside of this array here we have all the values for that one line. What's next is we'll create a new instance of our class, and now, whoops, not temp candy, candy. And now what we do is we just go through down our line, and we're going to say temp candy dot name equals, and this is where that ordinal, the order that it shows up in, starts becoming important. We say temp attributes 0. We know the first element is going to be the name. Next one, flavor equals temp attributes 1. And then lastly, dot quantity equals temp attributes 2. And again, oh, we got back with this quantity again. Remember, we said we did not want that to be set. We said it wanted to be read only. So our only other alternative is to set that on the constructor. And so what we can do now, and let's take a look, I'm going to go over my class, right click, go to definition, and what we want to do here is I think we want to overload the initial constructor so that we can pass those values in. And we could even go so far as doing each of the attributes, but remember, we're the architects here, we're the developers, so we can decide what it is that we want to do. if we wanted to provide a constructor where they can set the initial quantity and the initial quantity only, we could do that. There's no specific rule that says, well, if you're going to pass in a constructor with all the arguments, it has to be all of them. It doesn't have to be. We can do just one if we wanted to. The same rules apply that the order and the number of arguments have to be different per each overload. But this is definitely something that we can do. So now going back into our form code, instead of trying to do this here, instead we can do that up there and pull that in. So now when this is all done, we have an instance of our class that contains those attributes that we read out of the file. We have one more thing to do, is we can't forget that we have to add it into our collection. So we add and we say temp candy dot name because of the key. So this should give us what we need. This should happen on form load, so we should call it there. And now that we've actually been loading values into it, we should update our list items like this. Let's see what happens. Sure enough, you'll see we got all of our values coming into place. So if I like this, everything looks like it's working okay. I'm going to go back into my text file here and maybe add some more. There we have it. We can still go through, add each value. Now we're still not technically persisting data, but one thing that you'll notice, one thing that you will notice is that this is a lot easier than actually pulling that value in itself. If you remember, having to type the form out each time I add it in is very tedious. So this is another way of giving us those default values that we've been hard coding up to this point. I'm going to put this code out inside of the 10, 30, 12 folder in the VB intermediate repo. I'm going to comment the code out. It's probably going to be a little more cleaned up on it, so it may not completely match up with what you may have had if you were following along with me. So by all means, keep your code, but maybe compare it with mine or pull it down and take a look at it, because it is going to be in a separate folder. I am going to make the next assignment available out on Blackboard. For those of you that are caught up on your assignments, please take a look at it. It is a lot of stuff, so take it with a grain of salt in that we have not covered all of that material. But I want to open it up early so that it gives you some context on what we are talking about in class, and we can start talking about what are we going to do for a design and how do we approach it. So if you're feeling brave, go out and take a look. It is certainly not due next week. This is a big project, and so it's something that we're going to take a look at, and we will talk about it some more. The next lecture, as I mentioned, will be about writing the data. This would be reading the data from a file, but the other half of that is writing the data out. So essentially we have an application that can load data and then store the data that you've worked with and edited on top of that.